You are looking at a number that most Western analysts are refusing to put on their front pages. In 2024, Indian-owned or Indian-led corporations directly employed over 1.1 million people in the United Kingdom. Not outsourced workers, not contractors. Permanent full-time employees, sitting inside British institutions, running British supply chains, signing British payroll checks. That number has grown by 34% in under a decade, and if the current structural trajectory continues, by 2027 the footprint will be unrecognizable to anyone who still thinks of India as a developing market. This is not a feel-good story about globalization. This is a cold, calculated structural realignment that has been years in the making, executed with precision by Indian capital, Indian talent, and Indian strategic vision, while the United Kingdom spent the better part of a decade in institutional paralysis, debating the terms of its own exit from the most powerful trading bloc on the planet. What you are watching right now is not a trend. It is a permanent restructuring of who owns the commanding heights of British industry. Welcome to the Strategic Intelligence Report. I am your senior strategist. Pull up a chair, because today we are going inside the war room. Let us begin with the architecture of this shift, because if you do not understand the structural foundation, you will keep mistaking symptoms for causes. The United Kingdom, for much of the 20th century, operated on a specific global assumption that British capital, British institutions, and British soft power would remain the anchor of a post-imperial economic identity. The Commonwealth was supposed to be the instrument of that continuity, a network of nations that would trade on favorable terms, supply raw materials and talent, and look to London as the gravitational center of their own ambitions. India played along for a time. It had to. In 1991, when Manmohan Singh dismantled the License Raj and opened the Indian economy to the world, the country had foreign exchange reserves that could barely cover 3 weeks of imports. It needed Western capital, Western markets, and Western goodwill to stabilize its transformation. The United Kingdom positioned itself as a natural partner, a bridge between the old Commonwealth and the new global economy. But here is what the British strategic establishment failed to model correctly. They assumed that dependency was structural and permanent. They assumed that India would always need the United Kingdom more than the United Kingdom needed India. That assumption was the single most expensive strategic miscalculation in British economic history. Because what happened between 1991 and 2024 was not just growth, it was capability accumulation on a scale that the British political class was ideologically unprepared to process. To understand why this is a turning point, we have to look at the data they missed. In 2006, Tata Group, one of India's oldest and most globally ambitious conglomerates, acquired Corus, the Anglo-Dutch steel giant, for $12.1 billion. At the time, British commentators framed it as an anomaly, a one-off, a story of emerging market ambition that was probably slightly overpriced and would likely struggle with integration. The British press was polite, but the underlying narrative was patronizing. India had bought something it probably could not run. 18 months later, Tata came back, and this time they bought the most emotionally significant industrial brands in British history: Jaguar, Land Rover, two names that sat at the absolute center of British industrial identity, acquired by an Indian company for $2.3 billion from a Ford Motor Company that had run both brands into the ground and was desperate to exit. What happened next is the data point that every serious strategist should have tattooed on their strategic framework. Tata did not just stabilize Jaguar Land Rover, they rebuilt it. Under Indian ownership and strategic direction, JLR went from losing money to generating revenues that at their peak exceeded 27 billion British pounds annually. The company became one of Britain's single largest manufacturing exporters. It created tens of thousands of jobs in the British Midlands, a region that British industrial policy had been slowly abandoning for 2 decades. India did not save JLR despite being Indian. India saved JLR because of what India had become, a civilization with a 5,000-year tradition of complex systems thinking, now supercharged by engineering talent, long-term capital patience, and a strategic culture that thinks in decades rather than quarterly earnings cycles. That distinction matters enormously, and most Western analysts still have not absorbed it. If you value data-driven analysis over mainstream narratives, this is exactly the kind of structural intelligence that the mainstream financial press consistently undervalues. Subscribe to the Strategic Intelligence Report and join a community of strategic thinkers who are positioning themselves ahead of the global shift, not reacting to it after the fact. Now let us move deeper into the architecture of the 2027 projection, because the Tata story is not the story. The Tata story is merely the most visible chapter of a much longer and more consequential book. The real structural takeover of British corporate architecture is happening across 4 simultaneous vectors, and each one reinforces the others in ways that make the overall shift geometrically more powerful than any single acquisition or investment could suggest on its own. The first vector is direct corporate acquisition. This is the most visible mechanism, the one that generates headlines when it happens, but the one that observers consistently underestimate in its cumulative strategic weight. Consider the pharmaceutical sector. In 2008, Sun Pharmaceutical Industries, headquartered in Mumbai, began its systematic acquisition of British and European generic drug assets. By 2015, following its acquisition of Ranbaxy and subsequent strategic moves into Western markets, Sun Pharma had established itself as the world's 5th largest pharmaceutical company by revenue. Its British operations are not peripheral. They are integrated into the National Health Service supply chain at a structural level that would be extraordinarily difficult and expensive to unwind. Consider the technology and IT services sector. Infosys, Wipro, HCL Technologies, and Tata Consultancy Services collectively operate some of the largest technology delivery operations in the United Kingdom. TCS alone has over 20,000 employees in the UK. It is one of the top 5 IT employers in the country. And these are not low-value processing functions. These companies are running the core digital transformation programs of British banks, British government agencies, and British financial institutions. They hold the source code of British institutional modernization. When people talk about Britain's digital infrastructure, they are, in many cases, talking about infrastructure that is designed, built, and maintained by Indian engineering firms operating under Indian strategic direction. The second vector is talent institutional capture, and this is the one that British policymakers are most reluctant to discuss openly because it touches on questions of national identity that are politically radioactive. The United Kingdom's National Health Service, the most sacred institution in British public life, is structurally dependent on Indian-trained medical professionals. As of 2024, over 35,000 doctors registered with the General Medical Council trained primarily in India. In numerous NHS trusts, particularly in the Midlands and the north of England, the proportion of Indian-trained consultants in specialties like cardiology, nephrology, and general surgery exceeds 40%. Remove Indian-trained medical talent from the NHS, and the institution faces a staffing crisis that no domestic training pipeline could resolve within a decade. This is not exploitation. This is a structural dependency that Britain created through decades of underinvestment in domestic medical training combined with immigration policies that selectively welcomed the highest skilled products of India's extraordinarily competitive medical education system. The third vector is financial services penetration, and this is where the 2027 projection becomes particularly acute. The City of London, for a century the undisputed global capital of finance, is undergoing a quiet but profound transformation in its ownership and operational structure. Indian capital is flowing into British financial services through multiple channels simultaneously. Private equity operations backed by Indian family offices and institutional capital are acquiring British asset management firms, insurance companies, and fintech platforms at a pace that has accelerated sharply since 2022. The post-Brexit environment has been particularly consequential here. The United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union produced exactly what Indian strategic planners anticipated it would: a period of institutional uncertainty, regulatory fragmentation, and talent exodus that created acquisition opportunities at valuations that would not have been available in a more stable British political environment. While the British political establishment was consumed by years of Brexit negotiations and the subsequent management of their consequences, Indian institutional capital was quietly identifying, evaluating, and in many cases acquiring British financial assets at cycle lows. This is not conspiracy. This is strategic opportunism executed with the discipline and patience that characterizes the best Indian business culture. When your own institutions are in chaos, capital that is patient, well-capitalized, and strategically coherent will always move into the vacuum. To understand why this is a turning point, we have to look at the data they missed. Because the fourth vector is the one that will define the 2027 landscape most decisively, and it is the least understood. the India-United Kingdom Free Trade Agreement trajectory, and its structural implications for British corporate sovereignty. Negotiations for a comprehensive free trade agreement between India and the United Kingdom have been ongoing since January 2022, making them one of the longest-running bilateral trade negotiations in recent British diplomatic history. The delays have been multiple and complex. Indian negotiators have pushed for expanded mobility rights for Indian professionals, particularly in IT and financial services. British negotiators have been constrained by domestic political pressures around immigration. The agricultural and whiskey tariff disputes have generated their own complexity. But here is the strategic reality that the negotiation timeline obscures. Every year of delay advantages Indian corporate interests more than British ones. Why? Because in the absence of a formal agreement, Indian companies have been using their existing British presence, their existing regulatory relationships, and their existing talent networks to organically expand their footprint in ways that a formal FTA would only accelerate, not initiate. By the time an FTA is signed, and the structural logic of both economies suggests it will be, the Indian corporate presence in the United Kingdom will not be something that Britain is inviting in from the outside. It will be something that is already deeply embedded in British institutional architecture, operating as a structural pillar rather than a foreign entrant. That is the nature of the silent takeover. It does not arrive with a fanfare. It is already there when you think to measure it. Let us now map the sector-by-sector projection for 2027, because the macro-level narrative needs to be grounded in specific institutional realities if it is going to serve as a genuine strategic intelligence product rather than a rhetorical exercise. In British Steel, the picture is stark and the timeline is compressed. Tata Steel's operations in Port Talbot and Scunthorpe represent the last meaningful integrated steel-making capacity in the United Kingdom. The decisions made by Tata Steel's leadership in Mumbai about investment, technology transition, and production strategy will determine whether British steel manufacturing survives as an industrial capability or completes its decades-long contraction into irrelevance. The British government understands this dependency. The £500 million public support package announced in 2023 for the Port Talbot transition to electric arc furnace technology was not a subsidy to a foreign company. It was tribute paid by a sovereign government to maintain influence over a strategic industrial decision being made in another country's boardroom. In British education, there is a developing story that most financial analysts have not yet integrated into their frameworks. Indian education companies and Indian family office capital are beginning to move into the British private education sector, acquiring independent schools, tutorial services, and higher education institutions at a pace that will become significantly more visible between 2025 and 2027. The strategic logic is straightforward. Britain's reputation for high-quality education is a global export product, and Indian capital understands better than most how to operationalize that reputation within a rapidly expanding global middle class that is overwhelmingly South and Southeast Asian. This is not a coincidence. This is strategic capital following strategic insight. Now let us address the question that sophisticated observers will be asking at this point in the analysis. Is there a British strategic response? And if so, what is its structural adequacy? The honest answer, based on current macro data, is that the British strategic response exists at the level of rhetoric and is significantly underpowered at the level of structural policy. The India reset that characterized British foreign policy pronouncements under multiple post-Brexit governments reflects a genuine recognition that the United Kingdom needs India more than the post-imperial relationship framework suggested. British prime ministers have made high-profile visits to Delhi. The Rishi Sunak premiership, whatever its domestic political complexities, represented a symbolically significant moment in which the face of British executive power was itself an expression of the Indian diaspora's institutional assent. But symbolic recalibration and structural strategic response are not the same thing. The structural challenge for the United Kingdom is acute. Post-Brexit trade volumes with the European Union have underperformed pre-referendum projections consistently. British productivity growth has lagged the G7 average for over a decade. British public finances are constrained by a combination of legacy debt, aging demographics, and an energy transition that requires capital investment at a scale the domestic fiscal position cannot easily accommodate. Against this structural backdrop, the arrival of Indian capital is not merely welcome. In many sectors, it is operationally necessary, and that necessity is what gives India its structural leverage, not aggression, not geopolitical coercion, simply the mathematical reality that capital and capability concentrated in one geography will flow toward opportunity in another, and that the receiving geography's negotiating position is proportional to the alternatives it can credibly offer. Britain has fewer credible alternatives than its strategic establishment is publicly willing to acknowledge. The United States is a complex bilateral partner with its own domestic political pressures around foreign investment in strategic sectors. The Gulf sovereign wealth funds are significant but operationally concentrated in financial and real estate assets. China is politically radioactive in the current security environment. That leaves India as the single largest source of patient, high-capability, strategically aligned foreign direct investment available to the British economy in the medium term. India knows this, and India, under the current strategic doctrine of its government, is not naive about leverage. To understand why 2027 represents a structural inflection point rather than simply a continuation of existing trends, we have to look at the confluence of forces that will converge in the 24-month window between mid-2025 and mid-2027. The first force is the maturation of India's domestic capital market. The Bombay Stock Exchange and the National Stock Exchange of India have, in the past 5 years, deepened their liquidity pools, broadened their institutional investor base, and developed derivative and fixed income markets of sufficient sophistication that Indian corporations now have access to domestic capital at a scale and cost that fundamentally changes their outbound acquisition calculus. In simple terms, Indian companies can now do in London what they previously could only dream of, because the capital is available domestically and the currency is stable enough to make pound-denominated assets attractive without the hedging costs that previously compressed returns. The second force is the ongoing demographic and talent dividend. India produces approximately 1.5 million engineering graduates per year. It produces medical professionals, financial analysts, logistics specialists, and software architects at a scale that no other single nation on Earth can match. As the United Kingdom's workforce ages and its domestic skills pipeline faces structural pressures, the gravitational pull of Indian talent will only intensify. And talent, in the modern economy, does not just fill positions. It shapes institutional culture, builds professional networks, and creates the social infrastructure through which capital subsequently flows. The answer to all three of those variables, at this moment in history, is unprecedented and accelerating. The IMF's most recent World Economic Outlook projects India to surpass Japan as the world's third largest economy before the end of this decade. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and the international strategic advisory community broadly concur that India will be the world's second largest economy before 2075 and potentially before 2060 under optimistic demographic and productivity scenarios. These are not projections being made by India's government propaganda apparatus. These are projections being made by the same Western financial institutions that previously underestimated India's trajectory at every major inflection point in the past 3 decades. The structural error that Western analysis keeps making is to project India's future trajectory from a straight-line extrapolation of its recent past, when the correct analytical framework is to recognize that India is now crossing the capability threshold above which growth becomes self-reinforcing rather than dependent on external conditions. When a nation's domestic market is large enough to sustain world-class companies without export revenue, those companies develop the confidence and the capital structure to compete globally on their own terms. India crossed that threshold in the early 2020s. The British corporate acquisitions of 2025 to 2027 are the first wave of what that threshold crossing looks like in practice. There is a final dimension of this analysis that is perhaps the most strategically important and the most consistently underreported, and it is the role of the Indian diaspora in the United Kingdom as a structural transmission mechanism between Indian capital and British institutional architecture. The British Indian community, approximately 1.8 million people, represents one of the most educationally and economically accomplished diaspora communities in the world. Its median household income exceeds the British national average. Its representation in the professions, in financial services, in the technology sector, and in public life has reached a scale that would have been difficult to imagine even a generation ago. The elevation of a British Indian to the position of Prime Minister in 2022 was a symbolic marker of a deeper structural reality. This community is not peripheral to British institutional life. It is increasingly central to it. And this community serves, whether consciously or organically, as a network that connects British institutional knowledge with Indian strategic capital. The venture capitalist in London who went to school in Leicester and has family connections in Ahmedabad understands British regulatory environments and Indian corporate cultures simultaneously. That bilingual institutional fluency is a form of structural advantage that is extraordinarily difficult for competitors to replicate. When Indian capital looks at a British acquisition opportunity, it does not arrive blind. It arrives with a network of advisors, intermediaries, and institutional relationships that have been built over decades of diaspora economic activity. The due diligence is sharper, the integration planning is more culturally nuanced, and the post-acquisition management is more likely to succeed precisely because of this diaspora-mediated institutional knowledge transfer. This is the mechanism that makes the silent takeover silent. It does not look like foreign acquisition. It looks like familiar institutions being run by people who understand both sides of the equation. By 2027, based on current acquisition trajectories, talent penetration rates, FTA progression, and capital market development in India, the projections point toward an environment in which Indian-owned or Indian-led enterprises account for a structurally significant proportion of employment and output in British steel, British automotive, British IT services, British pharmaceuticals, and significant portions of British financial services and education. The combined revenues of Indian-owned British operations are projected, under the current trajectory, to approach 90 to 100 billion British pounds annually by 2027 under reasonable growth assumptions. That figure, if realized, would represent a transformation in the bilateral economic relationship that would fundamentally alter the negotiating geometry of everything from trade terms to visa policy to defense procurement to diplomatic positioning in multilateral institutions. Britain would not be in a relationship with India. Britain would be, in a very specific and measurable sense, structurally integrated with India's economic interests in ways that make the relationship more like a deep interdependency than a conventional bilateral partnership. An interdependency, when the flows of capital, talent, and institutional knowledge are asymmetrically aligned, is the sophisticated modern equivalent of what previous centuries would have called strategic dominance. The United Kingdom built an empire on exactly this logic. The irony that its own institutional architecture is now being penetrated by the most sophisticated instruments of precisely this logic, wielded by the most consequential former colony in its imperial history, is either a profound civilizational symmetry or simply the most predictable outcome of any analytical framework that takes a long enough view. The data says it is both. So here is the strategic question I want to leave with you today. As the global economic architecture shifts, as Indian capital deepens its penetration of Western institutional structures, and as the IMF's projections move from forecast to reality, the question is not whether this transformation is happening. The data has answered that question. The question is, how are you positioning yourself for the world that this transformation is building? Are you analyzing British corporate acquisitions through a framework that was built for a world that no longer exists? Are you consuming financial media that is still calibrated to a Western-centric model of how capital and capability are supposed to flow? Or are you building the analytical frameworks, the knowledge networks, and the strategic understanding that will allow you to navigate and potentially benefit from the most significant reordering of global economic power in the 21st century? Because the global order is not waiting for the mainstream narrative to catch up. It is moving, right now. In boardrooms in Mumbai and Chennai and Bengaluru, decisions are being made that will shape the British economic landscape of 2027 and beyond. The question is whether you are going to understand those decisions when they become visible, or whether you are going to be surprised by them the way most of the Western strategic establishment has been surprised by every major inflection point in India's rise. In the next report from the Strategic Intelligence Report, we go deeper. We map the specific financial dominance roadmap, the sectors, the transactions, the regulatory environments, and the strategic windows that Indian capital is moving through between now and 2030. We build you the actual architecture of the new global order, institution by institution, sector by sector, decision by decision. Do not miss it. And if you are serious about understanding the world that is actually being built, rather than the world that the mainstream press is still describing, you already know what to do. The shift is not coming. It is already here. The question is whether you see it.